After studying M theory as long as you have, do you think that it is the way to explain the universe, or do you think there may be a more complete theory with more testable predictions?
Well, I like to think that it might be the complete theory, but I'm also willing to say that if tomorrow we proved M theory or string theory, M theory is just a refined version of string theory, if we were to prove string theory wrong, I would rejoice. I would jump for joy. That would be incredibly exciting. And some people say, "Now, come on, really?" And I really do mean that. Because I'm not wedded to M theory or string theory or any particular approach. I'm wedded to finding the truth, or at least being a small part of the journey that takes this generation one step closer to truth. And if we could show that these ideas are not right, that would be progress. And it would indeed free us up to try to find what the right approach might be. So ultimately, the answer to your question is going to come from experiment and observation. And we've not been able to bridge that gap yet, but that's what we're heading toward. So it's hard for me to say anything beyond it smells good, it looks good, it feels good. The kinds of features that are emerging from string theory and M theory feel like they are what we need to have a final theory. But gut feelings and intuition, you don't make judgments or determine something's right or wrong. You don't adjudicate based upon what you feel. You adjudicate based on data. And that's what we have to wait for.
Hi, so a lot of children as they go to school are indoctrinated with religion, and what would you suggest is the best way to help, I guess, influence them in a more scientific way?
Well, it all depends what you mean by indoctrinated in religion. The details really do matter here. You know, no doubt you're familiar with some of my friends who go around the world saying that if you believe in religion, you're stupid. And I think that they're doing incredible disservice, both to science, to religion, and to the general openness that we should have for distinct pathways toward truth. Let me be really clear. I hope you glean from the remarks tonight that I am very excited about science. I love science. I love the ideas of science, but Jesus Christ, to claim that science is the answer to everything is utterly myopic. There are deep questions that really matter to us as human beings that science is unlikely ever to give us insight into. There are questions about the universe like, the temperature variation of the microwave background radiation. You pit religion against science, science is going to win, right? I've never seen a religious doctrine that predicted the temperature variations of the microwave background radiation. But so what? That yardstick is catering to what science does. Science is very good at that sort of thing, so we should use it for that kind of question. But there are other questions in the world. The deep nature of human existence, human spirit, the things that matter to us, the things that terrify us, the goals that we have, the need for community, the need for connection. Those sorts of issues and questions, I've never seen any aspect of science that gives us some sort of insight into that. Now, I'm not saying that religion is the answer, but for some people it is. And you know what? I'm fine with that. I think that's a wonderful thing. If in this bizarre, absurd place that we find ourselves, little beings crawling around a nondescript planet in the suburbs of an ordinary galaxy, we're thrust into this environment without any manual that tells us why we're here or what it's for. And if in that circumstance, some individuals find that they can have a certain kind of peace and comfort and a sense of meaning that comes from, say, religion, that's great. I disagree. Illusion according to science? Sure, but that's only one way of defining what's real and what's not. You're absolutely right. If you judge the claims of religion by whether or not they are able to explain the electron's magnetic moment, yeah, then you're right. Christianity, Judaism, Muslim approach? No. Nobody's been able to do a good job at explaining the electron's magnetic moment from those perspectives. But that's not all there is to the world.
Hi, you've mentioned that string theory is a theory of everything, and from what I understand, theories of everything reconcile general relativity, which explains very big, with quantum mechanics, which explains the very small. But I still don't understand exactly how string theory solves the quantum gravitation problem. How is string theory actually a theory of everything?
Yeah, so first off, I don't think I actually said string theory is a theory of everything. It is a phrase that's used. I'm not fond of it because, sort of as we were just talking a moment ago, it sort of suggests this scientism approach to the world where string theory embraces everything, and it doesn't. But what it does claim to do in more detail is exactly what you suggest, to put gravity and quantum mechanics together. So from that perspective, it's a unified theory of the laws of physics. Your question is, how does it do that? Now, the full answer to that would require you to come to a nice graduate course on string theory, where I would do the calculations and show you. But just to get a feel for what's going on here, the puzzle, the difficulty in putting quantum mechanics and general relativity together is that the languages used are radically different. So string theory, I should say quantum mechanics, is based on the uncertainty principle, which says that on microscopic scales, there's a lot of uncertainty, wild fluctuations. And when you apply that to the fabric of space, you find that space itself would be wildly undulating on small scales in a manner that Einstein's classical ideas from the 1920s can't cope with. That's the origin of the problem. What string theory does is, it kind of comes along, and imagine these wild undulations are happening in a rubber sheet, sort of the image that we often use for space, to have something to hang our hat on. String theory comes along and kind of stretches out the rubber sheet. So imagine that a rubber sheet is wildly undulating. When you stretch it out, what's going to happen? It's going to dilute the wild undulations. They're still going to be there, but they're not going to be so large because you've now spread them out. And that is a rough way of understanding how string theory copes with the old problem of putting quantum mechanics and general relativity together. And when you translate this into mathematics, it works. And what that really means, just to finish up the answer to the question, in the old days, if you tried to do a calculation that involved both quantum theory and general relativity, there's one answer that comes out of the equations, and that answer is infinity. And that's not like some profound answer, infinity. It's nonsense. When you get infinity out of a calculation in science, it's basically nature is grabbing you by the throat and slapping you and saying, you are doing something really wrong. The math of string theory doesn't yield infinities in these calculations. That's the concrete sense in which string theory offers dramatic progress in putting quantum mechanics and general relativity together.
Hi, so you mentioned before about not being able to travel back in time, but what about the idea of closed time-like loops which allow infinite interaction with the past as long as it doesn't break certain fundamental changes?
So I didn't say that you couldn't travel to the past. I said that it's an open question and we don't know the answer yet. So there are certainly some reputable scientists who've written down theories which allow travel to the past and allow travel to the future, and there's your closed time-like curve. Back to the past, into the future, back to the past. That's all a closed time-like curve is. And indeed, there are ways that you can avoid the paradox that I mentioned, or the paradox which is usually described as the grandfather paradox, the one that I briefly mentioned as a preamble. You go to the past, you kill off your grandparents, and then how was it that you were born in the first place to carry out that act? And there are theories with these closed loops in time where if you went back and tried to kill your grandparents, the laws of physics would prevent that from happening. There's no way that you'd be able to carry it out. That you may say, well, come on, there's free will. If I go back and I see granddaddy, I can just do it, right? Well, the laws of physics in some of these versions won't allow you to do that. The past is not something that happens in many iterations. The past is one moment in time. It's fixed, eternal, and unchanging. And if you were there, then you were always there. And what you did is always one unique act. And clearly you didn't kill your grandparents because you exist. And therefore, if you're back there again, you're forced to relive the act that's consistent with that reality. So you don't have the kind of free will, volitional control that you might think that you'd have. And therefore, you can't rule out traveling to the past by these paradoxes. There are ways around them, such as this. But that doesn't mean you can do it. And that's where things currently stand. We don't know if you can travel back. There are proposals using wormholes. Maybe you've heard about these ideas, tunnels through space, and if you play around the mouths of a wormhole, the tunnel through space becomes a tunnel through time. But we don't know if wormholes are real. Even if they are real, we don't know if you'd be able to travel through them. There are all sorts of questions. How would you keep a wormhole open, allowing something to pass through? These are the issues. But you can't rule it out simply by philosophical argument from the perspective of establishing there are paradoxes. You can avoid the paradoxes.
Hey, I think you touched on this a little bit a second ago, but you talked about compartmentalizing universes in the concept of multiverse and the conditions that are required for us to exist, basically, are quite deliberate, I guess, in a sense. But I recall a concept of gravity where potentially the reason it's so weak is that it might actually be spread out across multiple universes. Is there any way that the newfound kind of ways of measuring gravity as we know it can explain that in any way?
Yeah, so one of the ways that you can search for extra dimensions of space, one of these weird ideas, getting a little bit of feedback over here if you want to play with that, one of these weird ideas of string theory is by examining the strength of gravity exactly along the lines of what you're discussing, because it's well known since the time of Newton and before that gravity is a very weak force, right? You can establish that to your own mind just by doing a little experiment, right? Here on planet Earth, right? You got the whole Earth pulling on us right now. It's pulling on this bottle of water, but watch this. Wow, right? My muscles are beating out the whole Earth. Nobody impressed, you know. And thank you, yeah. And the reason why my muscles can beat out the Earth is the Earth is only acting through the force of gravity on the bottle, and the force of gravity is intrinsically very weak. Now, an explanation for that, along the lines of string theory and the extra dimensions, is much as you were indicating. Maybe it is that gravity fundamentally is a strong force, but if there are these extra dimensions of space, gravity kind of leaks into those extra dimensions, right? Imagine you have a house with all sorts of plumbing issues, right? So you turn on the faucet. If the water is leaking out through all of these pipes around your house, the water pressure is going to be very weak. Similarly, if gravity is leaking into the extra dimensions, then it's going to appear to be very weak on our macroscopic scales, even though fundamentally, like the house may have fundamentally high water pressure back at the source, gravity might be fundamentally very strong at short distances. So people have undertaken experiments to measure the strength of attraction between two masses, but examining that force on shorter and shorter and shorter distance scales, trying to see whether the strength of gravity might get stronger and stronger as you go beyond the leakage. You're going back to the source. So far, there haven't been any positive results along those lines. But that's one potential way that you could see the signature of extra dimensions. Now, if the extra dimensions are really tiny, you'd have to probe gravity on really short scales beyond what we can reach. We've only probed down to fractions of a millimeter now. But in principle, if you could probe gravity way, way down to a tiny, tiny fraction of a centimeter, then you might see a signature of extra dimensions by the strength of gravity getting much bigger. Yeah, so do the recent experiments change the way that we might do that? Not really. So indeed, through the gravitational waves, we have tested a very subtle impact of gravity on a detector, but we haven't studied gravity on short distance scales. We've studied a tiny effect of ordinary gravity on macroscopic scales. The effect happens to be tiny, which is different from studying gravity itself on tiny scales.
Hi Brian, how are you going?
Good, how about you?
Great, thanks. Okay, so I don't understand it, and I could be wrong here, so you can correct me either way. The start of the universe is a low entropy condition, the Big Bang singularity or boundary.
Yeah.
But black holes are high entropy singularities. I'm missing something because I don't understand why that's the case.
Well, everyone's familiar, of course, with these ideas. So the early universe and it's back to the question that you asked about the arrow of time, which we didn't actually specifically get to that idea. The fact that time seems to have an arrow suggests to us strongly that the Big Bang was a highly ordered configuration, very low entropy. Why do I say that? So entropy is just the measure of the disorder of a system, right? So if I have an egg and I drop it, it splatters on the kitchen floor. I went from a lower entropy starting point to a higher entropy messed up kitchen floor. High disorder coming from lower disorder. Now there's something called the second law of thermodynamics. I think most of us have heard about this. Some of you no doubt are intimately familiar with it, which shows us that entropy on average is always going to increase toward the future. Now if you think about that, that means that if you go back in time, if entropy is always increasing that way, then it should get lower and lower and lower towards the Big Bang. So for this picture to make sense, somehow the very beginning of our universe was a very ordered, pristine, low entropy state. Why was it like that? That's a big puzzle. We do not have an answer to that. In fact, when we study the laws of physics, it suggests to us that it maybe should have been a high entropy state. That's the more ordinary state of being. In fact, you mentioned black holes. Black holes are very disordered, very high entropy. Most of our theories suggest that the early universe should have been riddled with a whole bath of black holes, very high entropy state. But clearly it wasn't, because if it was high entropy, then we would now not be living through the unfolding from a low entropy, highly ordered, to the mixed order that we have now onto ever greater disorder toward the future. So that's the puzzle of time's arrow. Why did the Big Bang have such an ordered low entropy state? People have ideas. No way is there any consensus on this. This is one of the big open questions.
Hello there. My question is very simple.
I'm sure it is.
Behind your
It's always
academic
dangerous when a question begins that way.
okay. Behind your academic success, like you're sitting there and we're standing here listening to you, what would be the contribution of emotions compared to the intellect?
As you said, it's a very simple question. Well, perhaps one way of discussing it is this. You know, when we write physics papers, we're trained to write them in a very dispassionate voice. Right? We describe the hypothesis, the calculations that we did, and the results that we found. And that's what we do. And that's why when you read a physics paper, it's not exactly the most scintillating of experiences, right? But what that doesn't capture is the experience of finding the results. I mean, you know, in my lifetime, in my professional career, there really are just a handful of moments, a handful of results that I would say are kind of significant. They're not significant at the level of Albert Einstein, but they're pretty good. I mean, they made a difference. And in those discoveries, there was a lot of emotion, right? The very first big thing that I did, it was called mirror symmetry. Details don't matter. But the interesting thing is, the whole result hinged on a minus sign in an outcome of a calculation. Was it -3 or +3? -6 or +6? The minus sign is not the kind of thing that most of us get worked up about. But for months and months, together with my collaborator, a guy at Duke, Ronan Plesser, we were in anguish over this minus sign, because if it was wrong, if it's so easy to make a minus sign error, if it was wrong, we'd be going out with a big claim that was utter nonsense. So we were euphoric about the minus sign. We were terrified about the minus sign. We checked and rechecked. We couldn't sleep at night. It was a huge amount of emotion. But ultimately the paper says, so we found that if you take an orbital, it's probably not manifold, but you find that the Euler number changes sign. But you know, so that was how we described the result. And that's where the academic success comes from. But yeah, behind it's a whole emotional story. And I think getting those stories out there in the 1,000 variations that we scientists experience does change the way people think about science.
Okay, we have time for probably one or two more questions, so make them count. Hi, my one's really simple. Do you still stargaze in your spare time?
Do I stargaze? Well, the interesting thing about Manhattan. So it's a little hard, but you know, on occasion, you know, we do have a place that we sometimes visit where it is darker at night, and yeah, I mean, there's nothing like it, and I mean, this may suggest sort of a romantic vision that has no real basis in reality. It's probably true, but I just kind of feel that with so many people migrating to cities, and the impossibility of really experiencing the dark night sky in a big city. I don't know how it is here, but seriously, in New York, if you get 5 stars, it's like a starry clear night, okay? And since kids and adults don't experience that sort of connection to the other universe, we've become so insulated in our perspective, and I just sort of feel that if everybody had the experience on a regular basis of seeing what's really out there, that somehow it changed the way we relate to each other. But it's something that we're having less and less of, and it's likely to be the case less and less of it going forward. I'm sure this is a very simple question.
Probably not. So I've got 2 questions. The first one is that the core of string theory, as I've read it, is more about the energy and the movement of the filaments. Has there been a study around energy transference and the beginning of life, and the energy leaving the body, entering the body, and the recycling?
I mean, yeah, I mean, there are people who study that. As far as I can tell, there's nothing to it scientifically yet, and certainly there's no scientific connection to any of those energy studies in life with the fundamental ideas of string theory. And the reason for that is very straightforward. When we talk about string theory, we're talking about physics that takes place on distance scales on the order of, called 10 to the minus 35 meters. When you're talking about biological processes, you're talking about things that take place on tens of orders of magnitude larger. And to bridge the gap between those is something that we don't know how to do. It's like trying to understand how one particular grain of sand on a beach in Ethiopia is somehow affecting physics in the Andromeda galaxy. That's the kind of disjuncture of scales that would be involved in trying to suggest that string theory is understood in regards to how it affects things that take place in the human body. It's not to say that there isn't a link. If string theory is correct, there is a link. Just like that grain of sand is affecting what's happening in Andromeda galaxy, right? But the link is so tenuous, so small, so subtle that we can't pull it out yet. 1,000 years from now, 1 billion years from now, if these ideas are correct, sure, maybe we will have a whole theory of life in the human body that relies upon the fundamental physics of the basic ingredients, but we're nowhere near that yet, unfortunately.
We do have time for one more additional question. Final question.
G'day, Doc. Welcome to Australia, mate.
Well, thank you, sir. I've been waiting for that all night. You had me a good day, man. Good.
Hanging out in gravitational waves. So, if you were like a planet that was close enough to the source of this wave emanating, right, and you weren't drawn into the black hole that created the wave, and you were like it was an inhabitable planet, would you experience like a wave of time displacement rushing over you like a wave in the ocean? And would you be able to like look at like somebody at the other side of the planet and they're not in the crest of the wave, so they're like different time movement to you on the same planet? That's crazy. Is that the way it works? Or is it like not intense enough to create a time displacement?
Could you just repeat? No, I'm good, I got it. And the answer is, you are right on target, and I'm not being, you really are. So these waves, we talk about them as waves in space, but they are distortions in space-time. From Einstein's early work in special relativity, space and time are intricately interwoven. So when space is undergoing some displacement, time is undergoing a displacement too. Now, on Earth, the displacements are really small, fractions of an atomic diameter. We're talking about space, but if you were in a planet near where this is happening, yes, there would be a dramatic shift in space and a dramatic shift in time. In fact, it would be so dramatic that that planet would disintegrate under this kind of distortion in the space-time fabric. But yes, your image of what's going on is right on target.
Okay, I think Brian Greene has proven that he is the absolute master of making extremely technical things very understandable to everybody. So if we could thank him, give him a really big round of applause. Say before you go a word about this marvelous